Ladies and gentlemen, don't forget to pick up your tickets if you have not registered or signed up for the Jaipur Music Stage, which is slated to start at 7:30 p.m. this evening at the Charbagh, where you can go and listen to the wonderful Yugm, Raman Negi, and Parvaz, a beautiful orchestra and ensemble. And with that, we will be coming back shortly with the next session where Stephen will be in conversation with Anish.
You're inspired, but distractions come in the way. So come with me, Vayu Naidu, for a walk in the woods at the edge of a tiger's trail to a secret palace where we will be working together to write what you want to say to the world.
Reading was never meant to be a privilege, and yet in India, millions of children still cannot read at a basic level, denied not just books but the freedom that comes with them. The right to read should be public, free, and inclusive. Across India, as public libraries disappear, people who want to read have nowhere to go. That's why free community libraries matter. This is the work of the Free Libraries Network across India, building free libraries where anyone can walk in, read, and belong. Here, children become thinkers, and thinking builds confidence, empathy, and community. But spaces like these are disappearing. The right to read risks being a distant dream. Knowledge must be shared to be fair, because the right to read is the right to think. Join the Free Libraries Network, be an ally, and help keep the doors open.
शिक्षा सिर्फ किताबों तक सीमित नहीं होती, यह बच्चों के सपनों की शुरुआत होती है। HPCL मित्तल एनर्जी लिमिटेड बठिंडा स्थित गुरु गोबिंद सिंह रिफाइनरी के जरिए देश को ऊर्जा देने के साथ साथ समाज की जिम्मेदारी भी निभा रहा है। HMEL रिफाइनरी के आसपास के गांवों में 20,000 से ज्यादा बच्चों की पढ़ाई को शुरुआत से लेकर भविष्य तक लगातार सहारा दिया जा रहा है। स्कूल बैग, स्टेशनरी, स्मार्ट क्लासरूम, पानी और मिड डे मील शेड्स जैसी सुविधाएं, ताकि बच्चों को पढ़ाई के लिए एक बेहतर और सुरक्षित माहौल मिल सके। लड़कियों की पढ़ाई के लिए साइकिलें दी जाती हैं। स्वास्थ्य जांच और जागरूकता कार्यक्रम भी चलाए जाते हैं। स्टेम लैब, स्कॉलरशिप और मुफ्त कोचिंग के जरिए सरकारी स्कूलों के बच्चे आज IIT और NIT तक पहुंच रहे हैं। HMEL, जहां ऊर्जा के साथ भविष्य को भी मजबूती मिलती है।
बस 5 मिनट। चलो बेटा, अब लंच मैं रूम में खा लूंगी।
एक बार हाथ से निकल गए तो ये मोमेंट्स दोबारा नहीं मिलते।
अम्मा, आज ऑफिस डिनर है, देर से आऊंगा।
तेरे लिए बिरयानी बनाई थी, थोड़ा खा ले।
कल खा लूंगा ना अम्मा। अम्मा, सॉरी थोड़ा लेट।
अपनों को थोड़ा वक्त देते हैं, क्योंकि वक्त तो लम्हे फुर से उड़ जाते हैं। अब भी वक्त अपनों को साथ लेकर चलते हैं। रिश्ते हो या बासमती के दाने, क्लासिक बनाने के लिए हम सालों इंतजार करते हैं। इंडिया गेट क्लासिक बासमती, बनाइए हर पल को क्लासिक।
केसरिया बालम आवो ओ पिया प्यारी राठोला अवोरी पधारो मारे
Good afternoon and namaskar. We welcome you to this session at the 2026 edition of the Vedanta Presents Jaipur Literature Festival. Welcome back, dear ladies and gentlemen, at the Vedanta front lawn. We are absolutely delighted to introduce a bit of Fry presented by ThePrint. Witty, erudite, and endlessly curious, Stephen Fry reflects on a life lived at the intersection of acting, storytelling, and comedy. In this session, he shares insights, anecdotes, and the mischievous intelligence that have defined his career in conversation with Anish Gawande. I would now like to introduce our speakers. With a huge round of applause, let's welcome Stephen Fry. Stephen Fry is an English actor, writer, poet, comedian, television presenter, and film director. Notable acting roles include his award-winning performance in The Wilde, his iconic projects with Hugh Laurie, including A Bit of Fry and Laurie, Jeeves and Wooster, and Blackadder, and his memorable turns in blockbuster projects such as V for Vendetta, the Sherlock Holmes films, and the Hobbit series. His recent television credits include The Dropout and The Sandman. Stephen's recent European feature film Treasure has had its world premiere at this year's Berlin Nail. As a proudly out gay man, the award-winning Out There is part of his 30-year advocacy of the rights of the LGBTQIA+ community. He is in conversation with the dashing Anish Gawande. Anish Gawande is a politician, writer, and art world troublemaker. Based between Mumbai and Delhi, he is the national spokesperson of the NCP-SP and the founder of Pink List India, the country's first archive of politicians supporting LGBT+ rights. A Rhodes Scholar with degrees from Columbia and Oxford, he writes, translates, and curates at the intersections of literature, politics, and contemporary South Asian art. Continuing with the meaningful tradition of past 2 years, Teamwork Arts and Nupur Sansthan are once again jointly ensuring that the Jaipur Literature Festival remains inclusive and accessible for the deaf community. The interpreter for this session is Ms. Kashish Mitra. I would now like the start of the session.
Thank you very, very much for those very generous introductions. And thank you to all of you. Look at this. Standing room only. One more loud round of applause for Stephen, please.
Bless you.
Look at this fan following you. Enjoy her, Stephen. Look at all of this love.
It's,
I'm very grateful to be in conversation with you here today. And it's
Well-
for a very peculiar reason. When I was in the UK, I was studying and we had the pandemic going on, which meant that they had a very strange rule of 5. Which meant that only 5 people could be in any single room at any given point of time. You could either be very sad about this rule of 5 or you could get innovative. And what I decided to do in my cramped little dorm room was to throw costume parties over the course of the pandemic for 5 people only. And on Labor Day, I said we'll throw a party where you have to dress as your favorite lefty from history. And everyone came dressed, and there were only 4 others as Chairman Mao and sort of other figures. And I decided, following your footsteps, since you are Britain's national treasure, to be Oscar Wilde.
hey.
Because what are we here? What are we here? Gathered today, if not champagne socialists. So, on that note, I want to start here, Stephen, by saying you have occupied such an enormous part of the public imagination, not just in the UK, where you are a national treasure, but across the world. But you're a very unlikely national treasure. You've spoken a lot about your early childhood and the experiences you've had. What made somebody who was stealing credit cards and going to jail become Britain's and most likely the world's most loved figure on television?
Well, aside from brushing off these embarrassing compliments like flies, I would say I thought about why it is that I've been lucky enough to continue on my path over the decades. And I think the answer lies in a strange affliction of mine that is a blessing and has occasionally been a curse. And that is my love of language. And I think that comes from a number of things, but I'd paint it first as the fact that when I was sent away to school, to boarding school when I was 7, I discovered very quickly that I was very bad at everything that mattered. And at a boys' school, the first thing that matters is sport, athletics. I couldn't run in a straight line. I'd collide with a tree. I would trip over the white lines on the tennis court. I couldn't catch a ball. I would sort of clap at it. And the things that were shouted at me were unspeakable now, but essentially I was treated as if I was just a freak of hopeless, uncoordinated. So that was out. Music, I couldn't sing. I couldn't clap in time to music. I couldn't dance or move my body in any coherent way. I couldn't draw or paint, interestingly. So I was resigned to the possibility that my life would be one of loneliness and failure and all the rest of it. And then one day, funnily enough, at a music lesson, a teacher came, the music teacher, and he wrote on the blackboard, orchestra. And there was obviously going to be a lesson about the different parts of the Western orchestra, the strings and the woodwind and so on. And I just looked at it and screamed, cart horse. And the teacher said, what? I said, it says cart horse. Because for me, the letters just reassembled themselves into the word cart horse, what we know as an anagram, a very simple and obvious one, cart horse orchestra. And this had always happened to me. When I looked at a word, I saw the letters rearrange themselves. A bit like, do you remember Russell Crowe playing the mathematician John Nash in A Beautiful Mind, and he sees the numbers going around, and presumably mathematicians have the same relationship with numbers as I did with letters and words. And anyway, the teacher was interested and asked if I could do it, and I've always sort of done it to some extent, and in later life, I had a couple of amusing experiences. One was I was a friend of Steve Jobs, one of the founders of Apple Computers, and I remember he was in the earlyish, midish, late 90s when he'd come back to Apple, and he was telling me about the latest laptops, the power books as they were called. Do you remember the apricot-coloured ones, the clamshell ones? And I said, laptop machines are really interesting. And he said, duh. I said, no, laptop machines, really interesting. He said, what do you mean? I said, and it was a whiteboard. It was at the old Apple headquarters in Cupertino. And I wrote laptop machines. And I said, can't you see it? He said, what? I said, laptop machines is an anagram of Apple Macintosh. He said, you're fucking weird. But it was just sort of, I mean, these are childish things and uninteresting in a way. But and another example was, I remember I was lucky enough to be friends towards the end of his life of the great English actor Alec Guinness, whom some of you may remember as Obi-Wan Kenobi. And we would have lunch occasionally. And I was late for one lunch, and he'd been, you are very, very late. And I said, I'm sorry, Alec. I explained why. He said, as a punishment, you can finish the crossword. Because he'd been doing the crossword at the Connaught where we were dining. And I kind of did bits. And he said, very good. And he said, you're very good at the anagrams. I said, yes. I said, oh, actually, Alec, your name is an interesting anagram. He said, oh, I hope it's not like Alan Bates, because I used to call the actor Alan Bates anal beast. But anyway, I said, no, your name is an anagram of genuine class. And he said, I'm going to remember you in my will. Which he didn't, which was a shame, because he got points in the Star Wars, so his estate is still earning millions. Anyway, the point about it is, I suddenly realized I did have one thing. I didn't have sport or music or drawing or anything like that, but I had language. And this is odd, because everybody has language. We all have. All of you who are listening to me are using language as much as I'm using it in speaking. By processing it in your brain, we are all enjoying the nature of language. And as in reading, writing and reading, speaking and hearing, these are the two reciprocal arrangements we have in language that give so much joy and pleasure, that cause a fabulous institution like JLF to exist. But I discovered that most people only use language to say, pass the mustard, shut up, I hate you, go away, where's the toilet, and don't often think of it as being something that is beautiful in and of itself, that has, the very sound of the tongue hitting the tip of the back of the teeth is itself sensual and textural and joyful. And the use of language in silly, sensuous, absurd ways, using it as a music to beguile, to tease, to give pleasure, is something we all have the ability to do, but most people, for some reason, are afraid to do it. They're okay at throwing their bodies around in high jumps and in playing cricket and in using their body in expressive ways and in ways to do things that are wonderful. But language is somehow considered either an elitist area or something that's show-offy or something, but because it was the only thing I felt confident in, I leapt into it. I leapt into language. And I think that has been my salvation. In a sense, that's everything I am.
But you operate that language with a kind of surgical precision, and you have fun with it. There's a way in which you can take language and find something and then make it your ivory tower intellectual era and then sort of be pedantic, quite like this stage, and sort of talk down to people, quite literally. But you sort of operate within language with a different sense of joy, and you've always been self-deprecatory at times. You've said a cut glass English accent can convince an American of brilliance, even when there exists none, which I would agree to. But you've also sort of found humor through language, yes. Right? And you've allowed language to emerge through humor, and a little bit of Fry and Laurie as well. It's subtle ways in which language emerges through class, the sort of contradictions that come through, and it's poking fun while also sort of delving into the intricacies of language. How did that relationship between language and humor emerge for you?
Well, I'll tell you actually, and it involves a hero you've already mentioned. When I was about 10 or 11, I was at home. We lived in the country in a kind of sort of large old house, not Downton Abbey exactly, but it was a largish country house. And my father was a scientist, an inventor, a physicist, and my mother a historian, and neither of them really believed in television. And there was a very small television kept in a cupboard that was taken out if an American sort of decided to walk on the moon, or a member of the royal family got married, or Churchill died, or something like that. We were allowed to watch television. My father was away. He worked from home, as we'd say now, because, you know, he had a study and he did his stuff there. But he was away, so I took the television out one rainy Sunday, and there was a film on, and it was black and white because the television was black and white. I later discovered it was actually a color film. And it had already started, and I didn't know what it was. It was set in the past. It wasn't Shakespearean, it wasn't Jane Austen, it wasn't Charles Dickens. It was somehow in the past, and I couldn't quite place it. But everybody was speaking in the most extraordinary way. I'd never heard anything like it. And I remember a beautiful girl sitting at a desk, and a young man knelt in front of her and says, "I hope I shall not offend you if I state quite openly and frankly that you seem to me to be in every way the visible personification of absolute perfection." And I felt as if I'd been sandbagged. I couldn't believe language could do this. And the play continued like this. The film continued like this. And I ran to my mother afterwards and I said, Mummy, I hope I shall not offend you if I state quite openly and frankly that you seem to me to be the visible personification of absolute perfection. She said, "What are you talking about?" And I explained what I'd seen. She said, "Oh, that was the film of The Importance of Being Earnest by Oscar Wilde." And I said, "Well, what is it?" And anyway, being in the country, we were, as Sidney Smith once said, we were miles from the nearest lemon, and we were also miles from the nearest library. So the library in those days would come to us in a mobile form. A sort of Pantechnicon van would arrive with loaded with shelves and books, and I waited for it. And there were the 4 comedies of Oscar Wilde that I took out and sort of learned the importance of being earnest in particular, virtually off by heart. And there, all the uses of language that you described, Anish, are made manifest in the most joyful way. And even that sentence, "I hope I shall not offend you," etc., the visible personification of absolute perfection, you kind of get it. It's funny and joyous. It's funny because in the English language, if you express love to someone, you do it in Anglo-Saxon. "I love you, you're great, you don't say the visible personification of absolute perfection. We leave Latinate constructions to law and technology and so on, but we don't use it for love, which has to be direct and Anglo-Saxon, you're the best, And so by saying that you love someone by saying the visible personification of absolute perfection is preposterous. And yet then itself, it's a gift because you have stopped to use language and you've presented someone with this parcel of words that is so exquisite that you cannot but be charmed by it in a way that just saying "I love you" would never do.
Which is precisely what you do, right? Because your
Which is what
reading
I
of
do.
Wilde
Yes.
and your performance of Wilde is excess. You're embracing excess in all of its
Nothing
beautiful
succeeds
myriad
like
forms.
excess. Yes.
And and what you've made excess into a political act. You live life excessively. With Blackadder, with QI, you're really making excess into something to be celebrated, which is very un-British of you.
Yes, I suppose it is. I think I've always believed, and this sounds like I'm sort of being a bit sycophantic of my audience, but I've always believed that the British audience, and subsequently the world audience, as I've discovered, is far more intelligent and far more greedy for ideas and knowledge and thought and jokes that exist on a plane of thought and ideas and the life of the mind than people give them credit for. God knows, I love pure slapstick. I love Charlie Chaplin and Buster Keaton. I love, all that kind of silliness is adorable. But I also love things that are on a plane that tickle the mind, and I think an enormous number of people do, and that they're very ill-served. Television executives are terrified, or have been terrified, of that kind of thing. Oh, people will think it's elitist or whatever. And I don't believe that. Of course, some people will. Some people will just go, oh, long words just showing off. And, fair enough, people will think that. But I think, and these events prove it, there's an enormous appetite for having our intellectual glands tickled and for being awoken to the beauty of language, the expressiveness of it, and to ideas that challenge and provoke and go backwards. And Wilde, as the great paradoxicalist, is always doing that. I'm always finding myself repeating ideas of his, where, like when he said to Bosie, when they first met, I love young people. They have so much more experience than, and that's an obvious paradox. How can young people have more experience than old people? But whenever I meet young people, I'm always astounded. I've just been in a production of The Importance of Being Earnest. I played Lady Bracknell for 4 months in the West End, so the rest of the cast were mostly very young, who were playing the young lovers. And they were constantly talking about things I'd not heard of, and places and ideas and young, musicians and things that and I found myself thinking exactly the same. I love the young because they're so much more experienced. And life is full of these paradoxes, and I think they give pleasure and they make us smile, but they also make us think. And Wilde did that. He made us think. By reversing everything Victorian, the standard Wilde epigram is a reversal of what is acceptedly true. So the sort of cheapest and most obvious would be something like, work is the curse of the drinking classes, which is a very good phrase, because of course the average Victorian was busy saying, drink is the curse of the working classes. If they didn't drink so much, the working classes would be more industrious and they wouldn't, have such terrible lives. It's their own fault for drinking too much. But he, by reversing it, saying by saying work is the curse of the drinking classes, he's showing that if you turn something upside down, it's just as true. There are the drinking classes, the lazy Victorian people who drink, and they are afraid to work and to think. And if you can turn a morality upside down and show it to be just as true, then it means there is something wrong with the fixed and frozen world in which he grew up, the Victorian world.
And there's something powerful about that, right? Because in some ways, not embracing that excess is boring. To be sort of segmented into categories, to be told that this is a kind of humor that exists in this form, and this is something that cannot exist in such a form, is boring above all else. And you've said, a quote that stayed with me multiple times over, is that we are not nouns, we are verbs.
Yes.
And how do you sort of embrace this excess, not just as a matter only of language, but also in a time when we're all being divided into categories and algorithms and boxed into sort of age, class, religion, gender, sexuality, and all of these boxes as products?
How do we keep our sense of being a verb, of being a process, of moving and not changing and being in flux? It's Heraclitus all the way back, but T.E. Hume, the English philosopher poet, he described us in the wonderful phrase as a concrete flux of interpenetrating intensities. And that's a bit of a tough one to go through. But it was one of the founding ideas of modernism, is that things were, and why the Chinese character was so welcomed, because it contained the movement and the idea of things rather than fixing them. But that's what I really mean by being not a noun. It's an old phrase, I won't be labeled, is another way of putting it. But Wilde put it very well too, that he called it the dynamic life, or the artistic life that he then redefined as being dynamic. He said, anybody who knows what they want to be, a judge, a grocer, a general, even a writer or a poet, if they know they want to be that, they will become it. That is their punishment. But if you don't know who you are and what you're going to be, then every day, every year is a surprise, a shock, a disappointment, and that is your reward. Because, as he also put it, you have to taste every fruit of every tree of every orchard in the world, and some are addictive and terribly dangerous, some are toxic and will kill you, some are boring, some are, but to end your life not having tried them is an insult to creation. You don't have to believe in a creator God to say that. And so I think we should be allowed to make mistakes because we will try fruits that don't suit us. I had a long period of drinking too much and taking cocaine too much and wasted many, many years, it might be thought. But while I regret it and certainly wouldn't recommend it to anybody, I also understand that it was, I made some very good friends and I saw some interesting scenes and penetrated a world I would not otherwise have penetrated and had an understanding of things that I would otherwise not have understood. And I think I overdid it. A friend of mine, I think I can quote him, he won't be ashamed about this, the writer Jay McInerney, who wrote Bright Lights, Big City, the great New York novel of the 80s, he said, Stephen, he was giving me advice, when you're born, you are given a swimming pool of vodka and a bathtub of cocaine. You can't have any more than that. I think you're on your second bathtub and your second swimming pool. It was just advice for me to stop. So I stopped for that reason, and I'm still alive, thank goodness. But yeah, I mean, there are many things in life that are dangerous and difficult and dark, and there are many things to be ashamed of. I think one can be sorrowful about things you've done to yourself, but ashamed about things you've done to other people. You have the right to be difficult and dangerous in your own life and to cause yourself trouble, but not to cause trouble to others. So, I mean, this is what I used to say in the 80s when people, said, why did you come out as a gay man? Why did you do that? You didn't need to. And indeed, I didn't need to, as it were. And I said, well, because I don't think I'm not going to force everybody who's in the closet, as we used to say, to come out, but I refuse to be ashamed of who I am. I can only be ashamed of what I do. And if I do something bad, I can be ashamed of it. And I might hide it out of shame. But to be ashamed of what you are, to be ashamed, and for so many thousands of years, and this, the Genesis myth is one of the myths that tries to explain it. We've been ashamed of having a penis and breasts and a vagina. It's quite extraordinary. What an animal must think of us for being ashamed of that and for thinking they should be covered, as God rightly says to Adam in the garden. Not that I'm, as you probably know, I'm an atheist, but, he says, who told you were naked? Which is such a great question. Where did this idea come from that we should be ashamed of how we are born and who we are? There's so many things to be ashamed of, but those are not amongst them. And yet, most of our lives, we are covered in shame for who we are. And that's a terrible thing and something one tries to avoid. Yeah.
And I think perhaps, I don't mean to age you or call you old, but you sit here. But you sit here and you talk, Stephen, like an oracle. You've always been ahead of your times. You quit social media long before all of us should have. Yeah. And we bear the sort of repercussions of that even now in these dopamine loops we sort of find ourselves in. But what I want to get at here is that you've marked in your sort of refusal to be boxed in, to sort of reimagine a point that we've reached, perhaps, at the end of the process of Enlightenment rationality, where you've seen a sort of Enlightenment project that seeks to bring order into a world of chaos, collapse under its own weight, where today, in the age of large language models and generative AI, if you know what you want, you can get what you want. But the precise way to fight that is by not knowing what you want and giving in. And you've done that, but you've struggled with that. You've spoken about your experiences with bipolar disorder. You've spoken about this sort of inherent contradiction. And I want to sort of bring that in, right? That we do want to embrace that chaos. We do want to embrace uncertainty, but you're envious of order. You're envious of religion. How do we make those two talk to each other?
That's a terribly intelligent and interesting question. Thank you, Anish. Yes, I mean, like all of us, I'm still the victim of my own brain, my own mind, my own neural wiring, whatever it is, my own perceptions of how things are. And because I have this mental disorder called bipolar disorder, which is characterized by the current thinking in psychiatry as a mood disorder, which I describe as a climate condition, if you like, a weather condition at least. That's to say, it doesn't alter one's personality, but it alters the way you perceive the world around you. And so when it's raining, it's real, just as in the real world, when it rains, you can't pretend it isn't raining. You can't say, oh, I'm going to go outside and I won't get wet. It is raining. And sometimes your mind, it's raining, it's dark and it's cloudy, and you can't pretend it isn't real. You can't just say, no, this isn't happening. But also, as with the weather, you can't say it's your fault. You didn't make it rain, and it would be a mad act of solipsism or narcissism to suggest that you were responsible for the rain. Similarly, you can't ever be sure when it'll go or how it'll go. You can't make it go away, but you can be pretty certain, based on experience, that it will go away. The sun will come out. So you live in a constant state of a slight vulnerability to your own mind. So however much you're, and I'm making a mind-brain distinction here that may or may not be real. Funnily enough, one of my supervisors at Cambridge once said to me, you've got a pretty good brain, Stephen. Terrible mind. And I think I knew what he meant. But yeah, so your brain is telling you all kinds of things, but your mind is not letting you see them, or your mind is getting in the way. And I think we all have that problem, don't we? We know what's right, we know what's good, but our mind, and then again, our appetites are driving us in another direction, and our fears are driving us in another direction. And yes, I admire religion for all kinds of reasons. I admire the order it appears to give. When I say I admire religion, I admire the idea of religion. The instantiation of it is not so pleasing, obviously, or hasn't been on many occasions. I love the liturgy, the language of religion. Because I love above all metaphor and ritual. I love the idea that you can express deep truths in theatrical, dramatic, and ceremonial fashions. You see this everywhere, in every culture I've ever visited. People express the nature of their identity, their communal identity, i.e. their national identity, their cultural identity, in terms of celebrations, ceremonies, rituals, whether they be very personal, rites of passage for young people as they get older in different cultures, whether they be dances, whether they be, in cases like in Britain, rather extraordinary ways of expressing national identity through the metonym of the crown and processions and the donning of the crown by the monarch and what it represents, the scepter and the orb and all the metaphors that come out of these things. They're preposterous in many ways, but I think there's something very admirable about humans using those rather than trying to freeze them, much as I love language, into constitutions and into words which can always be given a different twist. That I think we respond very well to ritual and ceremony. And this idea, as I say, that language is what has most inspired me in my life, it's now brought, and I've often thought, the things I have embraced, I've felt like a puppy running into the mirror. I felt like that was social media. I believed in it. When it arrived in 2007, I was absolutely awestruck by the power and trying to explain what Twitter could be to people. And they were saying, well, you're just telling people what you had for lunch. I said, no, it could be more than that. And, there was this period, the so-called Arab Spring, starting in Tunisia and then spreading across North Africa and all the way to the Yemen and in Egypt in particular, having this amazing power of people suddenly being able to call corrupt leaders to account, and it seemed wonderful. And then the image I use, the metaphor I use is waterways. The rivers of Britain are very polluted at the moment. They're full of effluent and so on. The water companies who own them, because they've been nationalized, have polluted them, and you can't swim in them or drink the water, and it's terrible for the landscape. And water is a means of communication as well as means of pleasure and fulfillment and amenity. And this is what social media I saw as rivers of streams of discourse in which we could speak to each other in unique ways. And in the early days, these waters were pure, and you could swim and you could meet people and you could have fun and you could splash about and you could carry this pleasure through the waterways everywhere. But since they have become, part of the larger capitalism of Silicon Valley and beyond, they have become more and more polluted. Just as in industry, the rivers became polluted, now they are contaminated entirely. You wouldn't want your young children swimming in these streams of discourse. They are polluting and contaminating the minds of those who swim in them, and they have become the very opposite of what they were. And this seems to be a rhythm that happens throughout history. It happens to real rivers when Industrial Revolution happens. People are so interested in just making the money, incredible money there is to be made out of grinding out your product, that whatever poison you push into the streams doesn't matter until people start dying. And similarly, when it's a metaphorical river like social media, people pumping poison into it, and the profits are huger and huger, and we're slowly beginning to understand the terrible consequences
and
of
I'm
allowing
going to
this
have
to happen.
to cut this river short here because the river we have on social media has been cut off by you, so people don't get to ask you the questions that they used to be able to. So I want to open up for questions. We have around 5 minutes for questions, so can we please get some hands up in the audience there? Yes, the lovely gentleman with the glasses. Others who want to ask questions, can you please raise your hands? Lovely. The lovely gentleman.
Mr. Fry, you have played countless roles over so many decades, and The Master of Lake Town and Hobbit was one of the most memorable for me, being a nerd. So my question is, do you think the commercialization of fantasy cinema has turned epics and myths into products? Because these days, the fantasy movies do not capture that kind of music which Harry Potter, The Hobbit, The Lord of the Rings did, sir.
I understand. Yes, that's a good question. And, fantasy literature is not my absolute favorite thing in the world, but I, see its value. And having, done the audiobooks for all the Harry Potter books and for being involved with the Hobbit films, as you mentioned, it's been very interesting to watch. And I do believe that in fantasy, it really, really works when you read it on the page, because the figures that are fantastic, that are godlike and have extraordinary powers and can change shape and so on, when they do it in your head, in your imagination, they have a power that no CGI, no clever visual effects can match. And I think we had a session earlier on the Odyssey, and it's very noticeable that in films of Greek myths these days, like Troy and the ones, the return that Ralph Fiennes did of the Odyssey last year, and the one coming from Christopher Nolan, they don't include the gods. Because when you see the gods in a film, you think, oh, that's just ridiculous. Some big English actor going, oh, it's just sort of really silly. The gods have to be in here. That's where they live. And I think it's true of a lot of fantasy characters, that no matter how clever the visual effects, in the end, it's on the page that they thrive.
Thank you. The gentleman there at the back in the blue.
Hello. Good morning, Mr. Fry, and welcome to India. Or may I call you Jeeves?
You may.
Grow up reading the works of authors such as Mr. Woodhouse. Have you ever considered lending your expertise to Indian cinema? I'm sure there's a lot that we could learn from your perspective on things.
That's a wonderful question. I mean, Indian cinema obviously is the most thriving cinema in the world. And I did have a period about 15 years ago. I came to India to raise money from Indian film producers to make a film about a great Indian figure, Ramanujan, the mathematician, the Tamil mathematician, a man I've always been deeply fascinated in, probably one of the greatest mathematicians who ever lived, the most naturally gifted mathematician, whose story is a remarkable one. I don't know if you know it, but he came to Cambridge, and he came from from a Brahmin caste, and he had never worn shoes in his life, let alone worn a suit, and he had to arrive in a cold Cambridge at the time of the First World War. Had a most extraordinary relationship with the great mathematician Hardy. Anyway, I wanted to make a film about it, and I went to the palace in Delhi, amazingly, the great Lutyens Palace, to meet the president then, who was an ex-physicist himself and a great admirer. He gave me advice about it, and I met some producers and so on. And in the end, a film was made about called The Man Who Loved Infinity, and I played the part of a clerk who worked and employed Ramanujan, and I filmed in Chennai for a couple of days, a very small role, but Jeremy Irons played Hardy, and Dev Patel played Ramanujan, and it was a good film. I enjoyed it, but it's still a wonderful story to be told. That's the closest I've come, but I'm very, very open to it. But you won't get me singing and dancing in a Bollywood epic, I'm afraid. That you really wouldn't have the stomach for that. But thank you for the question.
Thank you. And the last question to the young lady here on the floor.
Hello, Mr. Stephen Bright. My name is Sharif Vijay, and I've actually watched the Pocoyo show as a child, and I was wondering, how was your experience working in the show?
Well, that's really interesting. You mentioned a show called Pocoyo, which is made for young preschool children. It's an animated film, and I narrated it, a number of series of it. And it's only really parents with young children or young children who've grown up a little like you who know about it. It was an enormous pleasure to make. And I suppose I can spread the question out into the fact that I've had the good fortune to narrate a number of children's things. I've done the Paddington books a little, and all of J.K. Rowling's Harry Potter, as I mentioned, and a few other children's things. And it's always an immense pleasure because, again, one's using language and the sound of the voice on the ear of a young person. One hopes to encourage them in the recognition of the beauty of storytelling, the real pleasure of leaning forward and wanting to know what happens next, the comedy and the excitement and the connection that comes from shared storytelling and the human voice, which I think, as we move into the age of AI, is becoming more and more valuable. These moments, these festivals, they seem big now. I believe they're only going to get bigger and more important because human contact, the sound of a human voice, a human tongue hitting a tooth, and the ear vibrating for real, and for us sharing the same air is going to become more and more important. And it begins with children understanding and one hopes celebrating the pleasure of storytelling. Around a fire, it's how we began as a species, telling each other stories about ourselves. And now we need it more than ever. And if I can say so, hurrah for JLF for being one of the great exemplars of that.
No, Stephen, I've spent many a JLF here in Jaipur. Never before have I had time being added for a conversation. So we're very lucky. We're not getting you off stage. So we have another 5 minutes. So thank you very much for 5 more minutes of questions. The lovely gentleman there with the glasses. Yes, if you could stand up.
Mr. Fry, how did you prepare to play the role of Oscar Wilde, and was it a life-changing experience for you? Because he was your hero and idol, I think, throughout your life.
Yes, he was. You're quite right, and it was very terrifying. I was quite scared because I hated the idea of failing, not just for my own shame and embarrassment at failure, but also because I didn't want to sort of let down how a new generation might perceive Oscar Wilde and his life and his works. But then again, I was damned if anyone else was going to do it, if I was going to get the chance. One of the things about film, of course, is the act of making a picture is very technical indeed. And as you probably know, very rarely is it shot in sequence. So while I was making it, I remember one evening, I had a brief drink with someone because we were filming quite late, and I just sort of said I'd see them for a drink afterwards, and they asked me, do you take Oscar home with you? Which seems a reasonable question. Well, I said, today we were at the studio, we were doing it in Shepperton Studios, we were doing 2 scenes. In the morning, we did a scene with Oscar on the treadmill in prison. When he first was in prison, before he became a bit iller, he was made to do what everyone was made to do, and that was stand on a treadmill treading this huge kind of wheel. It didn't do anything. It didn't dry clothes or, wash or produce power or grind corn. It was a pure punishment wheel because his sentence was 2 years hard labor when he was sent to prison. He was in agony, of course. It was absolute. He was the center of the biggest scandal of the Victorian age. His name was now spat by people, could hardly be spoken by his friends, a bit like Christ. He was denied by his own disciples. And he was at the lowest possible ebb a human being could be, really, utter despair and despised and rejected of men. And then in the afternoon, we shot a scene where he's sent down into a silver mine when he's a young man touring America with his whole life in front of him, the most brilliant student that Oxford had produced for generations, his name already famous for the way he spoke and the way he dressed, even though he had not written anything great yet. He was already bound for glory. Everybody predicted nothing but wonderful future for him. And that was the Oscar I was playing in the afternoon. So which one would I take home? A man crushed or a man full of hope? So in the end, what you have to do to prepare to play a part like that is you have to read everything you can, understand everything you can, and then submit yourself to the vertical moments of filming, where there are vertical slices of time that you have to inhabit, rather than the horizontal sweep that you hope will emerge.
Did it change your reading of Oscar Wilde, performing Oscar?
I think it made me understand more his love of his family, which is a very important part for him, his children and his wife, whom he adored, and the tragedy of his wife's rejection of him at the end, which was his own fault. He was a flawed man.
On the last row, sitting down, somebody had their hands raised. If you could stand up. Yes, could we get the mic to them, please?
Hello, I want to ask, does that feeling of alienation that comes sometimes just by being different, I'm putting that in quotes because sometimes it's out of our control, so does that feeling of alienation ever go away as you age?
What a brilliant question, and I'm afraid, although I'm also pleased to say the answer is no. I still feel as if I was dropped into a world into which I, frankly, had no reason to be dropped and had sort of, well, an alien. Alienation is right, that, I had this view when I was a child that when I was walking along the street, everybody who passed me was like an extra in a movie. They'd been given the role of being someone to convince me that there was a real world, and that around the corner there was an assistant director saying, he's coming around the corner, okay, you're a window cleaner, you're a wife with 2 children shopping, shout at your children, you're a driver, you're just a businessman walking along, okay, he's coming. And then I go around the corner and there are all these people living their lives, but are they real? Are they as real as mine? I couldn't really believe it. I mean, I'm talking about when I was a teenager. That solipsism, that sense of being alone in the world and being the only real person who felt things, who saw things, who understood things, who was moved by nature truly. And then you read poets and others who seemed to share this sense of both absolute connection with nature and a sense of astonishment at the world, but also a sense of alienation from it and separation from other people. It's kind of arrogant and absurd, because my greatest, as it were, successes have been from trying, I suppose, to share my experience and to show that we are all one and that we do have the same experience. But the paradox is we all have the same experience of refusing to believe we have the same experience, if you see what I mean, this sense of difference. But I think the alienation is the nature of the modern hero. We are both, the way I put it in my first autobiography was that we both yearn to be a part of the tribe, a part of the crowd, a part of the world, to be accepted, to be loved and hugged and embraced into the world, and we long to stand apart from it, to be different. Who stands strongest stands most alone, I think is one of the, Ibsen, is it The Master Builder? Or, and we want to be different from everyone else. And it's that push and pull, that tension between belonging and wanting to stand apart, that I think energizes not just the artist, but certainly does energize the artist, but energizes all of us who kind of still refuse to freeze into a fixed morality and a fixed view of the world and live that dynamic life that Wilde talked about.
Stephen, thank you very, very much. I think what I'm leaving from this conversation, and I certainly hope others are leaving with as well, is your quiet refusal to accept this sort of positivism that says it gets better, or to embrace things for the sake of embracing them, but to reaffirm that chaos is important, that embracing the beauty of language is important. Once again, thank you so, so much, Stephen. What an absolute pleasure. Another round of applause for Stephen Fry, please. Thank you very, very much.
With a huge round of applause, we would like to thank Stephen Fry and Anish Gawande for this wonderful session and request them to accept a scarf from the JLF. Ladies and gentlemen, we would like to thank ThePrint for this session. We look forward to seeing you at the next session at Front Lawn, a book launch, first edition, Babji Maharaja of Marwar Jodhpur, The King Who Would Be Man, by Yogi Ved and Amarnath. The session will have Amarnath, Yogi Ved in conversation with Reema Huja.
Thank you.